Hello, thank you so much for joining us today. This is Tools for Navigating the COVID-19 Communications Landscape. We really appreciate you joining us, and it should be a great experience. Are hoping that we're going to give you some tools and resources, and let you know moving forward as COVID continues and other events we're going to be facing. There's always communication challenges. So thanks so much for joining us. Okay. Great. This is a question we always put the slide up first because besides just our cover page is we get this question often, how to ask questions during the webinar. So the issue is that there's a question box. You'll see the picture there on the left. Do ask a question. We will take questions at the end. So if, as Barbara and I are speaking, you have a question, please feel free to put it in the question box. We will make sure we get to them at the end. We'll have ample time to do that. The other question that we get all the time is, how can I get the slides? Which is great. We love that you all want our slides, which is always good. We're always happy to share information. So we're sent them out in a separate email after the webinar. And also the recording will be sent out, and you can view it from our Connect Consulting Services YouTube channel. Barbara Wishman also just shared that she'll put it on her site as well. So for a team out or a team out. So, okay, we'll get in. Here we are. So I'm Nora O'Brien. I am the CEO of Connect Consulting Services. Been in the emergency management and business continuity field for quite a while, since 2002, and have a master's degrees in public health and public affairs and disaster and emergency management. I'm also a certified emergency manager and a former public information officer. That's really relevant to our presentation today, and actually have taught for 4 years the advanced public information officer course for FEMA. But I've also led H1N1 pandemic response, done wildfire, hurricanes, etc. And we were lucky enough to be named Women-Owned Business of the Year in 2018 by the Sacramento SBA. And my colleague Barbara Wishman, she can share with you her experience and go from there.
Thank you, Nora. I think most pertinent to our conversation today is that I've been active in the communications field, if you will, for 20 plus years. We support, as an agency, full service agency, I lead a team of communicators that really focus on how to reach your target audience more effectively. But for today's topic, one of the increasing areas of our work has been in the disaster preparedness, emergency preparedness, and public awareness area, in addition to crisis communications for enterprises, large and small. So I hope that I can contribute today with some examples and best practices, if you will, to help our listeners today, prepare on their own and hopefully take some good tips and trends from us today.
Great. Thank you so much, Barbara. Okay, so moving on into our agenda, we've actually got a pretty simple agenda today. We know that for those of you who have joined our webinars before, we kind of pack things to the gills. So we're trying to simplify a little bit our agenda. But today we're going to talk about the current COVID crisis, and you're like, ho hum, oh my God, COVID is my every waking thought. We get that, but we're going to kind of talk about what's on the horizon and how it relates to communications, and more, not just communications per se, but communicating effectively and timely. So, and then we'll talk about some crisis communications definitions that will lead into the case studies that Barbara's going to share, which are great. And then we'll actually have some tools and a checklist that we'll provide you as a handout in the webinar follow-up email. So, and questions and comments. So moving on here. So why it's important to kind of know where we are. This is it's not just WHO, it's World Health Organization pandemic phases. Unfortunately, we all can see that we're in the widespread human infection, transmission phase 5 to 6 of the pandemic. We're not yet in the post-peak phase. We certainly want to get there, and we don't quite know the time frame. Like H1N1, when I led the effort for H1N1, we had a vaccine within 6 months, and it was not nearly as virulent as of a strain that, and it was influenza. This is coronavirus, a different type of virus, but a different type of event. But the issue is that we had a vaccine within 6 months. We're not going to be necessarily, we've seen from past history that COVID-19 unfortunately is very, very virulent, and unfortunately very, very deadly, which is horrific. Where the point is that we're going to at some point get to the post-peak phase when we kind of go back to what we call normal. It's actually really a new normal. You probably have already experienced that. But what's going to happen is when people kind of go back to their daily living, and you're going to still have a rise, and then we'll at some point get to the post-pandemic phase. Why is this related to the communications? Is that you kind of need to have some messaging for your organization, agency, business, school, fill in the blank, for the folks we have on the call today. You kind of have to know what's ahead and actually develop some communications tools and messaging for each of those phases. So the other thing that we're dealing with is that COVID-19 facts. This is as of yesterday. The hot link at the top there, and that first bullet, 2.31 million cases just in the US. 7 million cases, I believe, across the world, 121,000 deaths. It's very sad, certainly. And unfortunately, we're not here to debate whether masks or reopening. We're not here to do that. But I'm just saying those are what the the stone cold facts are. But we also are dealing with what's ahead. Is that the 2020 wildfire season is slated to cause significantly more fires. We're in drought conditions in most parts of the West. We're based in Sacramento. We even had a fire that burns over 5,000 acres in less than 4 hours because of those winds when they pick it up. So it's low humidity, high winds, fuel for the fire, and that's equals quite a bit of disaster and such. So wildfire season's slated to cause more fires. So you need to think in terms of communications, what that means in terms of COVID. Like, what if I have to evacuate and I need to communicate where let's say I'm a community, I need to figure out where people that are currently dealing with COVID are, quarantined due to COVID, and where are they going to go versus the people, the general population. So again, that communications piece is important. We've seen quite a bit of civil unrest related to the racial injustice that is really coming to a light in many communities across the country. That is another issue that is complicating and also relates to communications of, face masks, social distancing, hand washing, which are the 3 important things, and dealing with civil unrest. We're also likely to have public safety power shutoffs, PSPS events in the West Coast, because of the drought conditions and the wildfire threat. So that also might have some, are you a business that has been reopened and now you have no power and you're dealing with COVID and you want to communicate to your employees or communicate to the public, are you open, are you closed? Are you taking takeout orders or whatever that may be? In addition, we know the hurricane is slated to be a horrific hurricane season, and this is not like, this is not a bingo card, as some of my fellow emergency managers like to say, oh, great, what else is next? Alcoholic monkey that killed someone, and that happened in, I think it happened in Indonesia, and like, oh, great, one more thing for our bingo card for 2020, another drinking game or whatever it is. But what it means is there's thinking about messaging. It's really kind of what it comes down to. Severe weather, there's might be more tornadoes. It's always earthquake season. Just yesterday, a 6.8 earthquake in Mexico, outside of Mexico City. And then 90% of all disasters are flood related. And you're like, what? That seems wrong. Well, storm surges, hurricanes, dam failures, a water main break from an earthquake. Again, it's all related to, excess rain, all those kinds of things. But 90% of deaths. So this is not a gloom and doom thing, but the point is there is specific messaging for your internal to your staff, but also externally to your stakeholders, whether it be patients, whether it be students, whoever that may be. It's just important thinking about messaging. The other thing we want to just let you know was in some tools about managing a crisis. This concept of the OODA loop actually came out of the Air Force, from my understanding. The hot link at the top of there of the bullets gives you a wiki of information of it's not something we made up, but emergency managers tend to use this quite a bit because in disasters, there is always new information that comes to light, and we have to make decisions based on that information. So the OODA loop is, in fighter pilots, is oftentimes they do quite a few maneuvers where they're going upside down and all around, and they have to figure out and sometimes make split-second decisions. So what the OODA loop is they observe what's going on. It's like, okay, what's going on? And then the orient part is, where am I in the equation? Am I up, down, all around? And then I might have to make a decision based on what's going on. And then I take an action. And again, sometimes like you're a fighter pilot, it's a split-second decision. Sometimes you take an action as emergency manager, and like a week later you go, okay, well, that didn't work, or we have new information came to light, there's new requirements, or there's new guidance on hand washing or face masks, et cetera. And then it starts it being the loop, because you've got to sometimes, it's not going to make one decision, take that action, and you're good to go, because there's as new information becomes a light, you're going to continue to have to make more decisions. But figure out what's going on, get that situational awareness, orient to what's going on to you and how you and your community, how that impacts you, make that decision and take that action. So, okay. We're going to talk a little bit about some definitions. What is risk communication? So risk communication, obviously we know what a risk is. It's a threat of a loss, or real, it could be perceived, to something that we value, like we're at risk for all sorts of other things. Communication is communicating that information about that risk. That seems really simple, but essentially it's a science-based discipline. Dr. Cavello for the Center for Change and Risk Communication is one of the leading thought leaders on this topic. And so but this risk communication, what that means is when we're saying things like wear masks, hand washing, social, physical distancing, all of those things, what we're communicating in an efficient and effective way, the most information that will and help you to mitigate that risk. That's the whole point of mitigating that risk as best we can with efficient and effective communication. Okay, and there's some core principles, and you see this played out, unfortunately, right now in a lot of the events that are going on. So when people are really concerned, they're stressed, they're upset, they want to know that you care. So that you could be you as a public health official, it could be you as a business owner, it could be you as a school, but they want to know that you care before they care what you know. So basically that empathy and that trust is just really important, and how to convey. So it's not just, sometimes it's not just what you say, it's how you say it, but showing that empathy and that you care really does go a long way for people to understand, like, oh, okay, they care about me, and not saying that they don't care what you say. The point is showing that empathy early in the process when you're trying to communicate what your next steps are. If you've had to change, let's say you didn't have a mask order, like for example, here in California, we know how all Californians have to wear masks in public settings. And you want to share that we're here for you. I was just in a grocery store this morning, and people did not have a mask, and you can get into a fight about it, or you can say, here, this is here for your, is for your safety, etc. So, but that caring and that you care, they want to know that you care. Showing that empathy is really important. The other piece, this other concept of mental noise theory is, people, if they're really stressed, we are at a breaking point, and you give them too much information, they are not going to understand. They're not going to really retain the information you try to give them. So that's why this mental noise theory of keeping it simple, keeping calm, and showing that information, because they might hear it, but they're not going to retain it. So that understanding and remembering, if you want them to remember that information, keep it simple. So don't give them 17 things that they need to make sure that they do for this pandemic, or when the hurricane's coming, or dealing with a wildfire. Give them maybe 3 simple things. Once they understand that, and it doesn't mean that people are simple or stupid. The issue is they're in a stressed mood, and the more the calm that you convey with your words, whether it's orally, or whether it's in written communication or social media or whatever that may be, video, that understanding and calm goes a long way. Other thing is, people focus on what they hear first. And so if you have a message that is really critical, you want the individual to hear, you say that first, and then you also repeat it last, because it basically, if you have some bad news for people, you may want to say this, and that people may not take it well. You say it first and you repeat it again, not to rub salt in the wounds necessarily, but sometimes what they hear first. So just really thinking about the order of things. Again, people are in stressed situations. They're not really sure what to do. They want to hear from, whether it's your public information officer at local public health department, or in a hospital, or whatever it may be, or you might be at school principal. But what they focus on, what they hear first. So that mental noise theory, thinking about being really cogent, and also very simple information first. The other thing it's important is the trust factors. When you're in really high stress situations, that empathy and that caring, as I said, in the listening, they assess this in the first 9 to 30 seconds. If you're not showing empathy, they're going to go, they don't care about me. Why am I listening to what this person has to say? So that when you're in a high stress situation, this is not the time to blame. This is not the time to shake fingers at people. This is time to say, if you're putting out a public message, you want the public, you want your internal stakeholders to learn that listening, but also empathy and compassion, that's got to be forefront in what your messaging might be. And then competence. Am I, getting something that I got off the internet that's not well vetted, or am I going to the CDC in terms of a public health crisis? If I'm going to, local public health, or whatever but go to a trusted source. So that competence. And if you don't have that information, do your best to share that information that is effective. Don't put out information that is cannot be, that's in. And it could be sometimes when we're putting out information in time of disaster that we give out bad information, which is certainly fine. As long as you go back and say, we have new information. Remember the OODA loop that we talked about a bit ago? Like, we knew that this was a piece of information. face coverings were not ordered, a number of months ago, and now they are today, and they're recommended by the CDC and many states, because we think it's something that will protect protect me and protect you essentially from the virus, in order to prevent that second wave that we certainly don't want to have to be dealing with. And so it's really important to say, if you can make a mistake, there's no wrong piece of that, as long as you quickly say, here's the information I had at the time, new information came to light, here's the updated information. So that honesty and openness really will go a long way. And then other factors such as, again, credibility, that's what it comes down. And so this is in really high stress situations. I'm going to now give it over to Barbara. I'm going to give you some case studies that maybe of what to do and what not to do in time of high stress situations.
Yeah, thank you, Nora. The first example is really a public example. I think we may all recall it. The oil spill, caused by BP teams. And the reason I'm calling it out is that we may still recall the actual sequence of responses on the part of the company. The initial CEO really was not conveying the kind of concern that you spoke to earlier, right? It was more of a typical, almost like a no comment kind of situation, where, when you think about the environmental impact, as well as the fact that 11 workers were actually killed, it required, in many minds, a more caring kind of response. And the lack thereof was really turned into a storm, a media storm. Government got involved. All the stakeholders that you can think of, were really perturbed, to say the least, about the way it was handled. And as you can see from the quote here, the gentleman was quite outspoken about it. In his, he felt actually under attack, which in a way he was, but it was because the public and all the stakeholders on the part of the company felt a lack of acknowledgement and accountability. And so what the company did fairly swiftly was appoint a new CEO, and you may have seen the ads at the time where the company really took responsibility for what occurred, and then put a number of actions in place to mitigate. I don't want to say remedy necessarily, because the lasting, consequences of this disaster, but in terms of managing the brand, and this is something you will hear me say a few times, we distinguish not so much in the tools as much as who are you targeting in your communications. Is it, if you're a school, if you're a public entity, it's one thing. If you're a commercial entity like a corporation or even a small business or anything in between, you have multiple different audiences. One is your internal, that's the same, your employees, whoever is involved with the company, and then your particular audiences, your customers, your clients. So to get back to BP, they were actually able to manage this in a very succinct manner, in that they took on the liabilities, they paid, they made amendments through funding and sponsoring charitable organizations, and then also being very in tune in terms of their voice to the community. So from our vantage point, sort of starting around 2018, they kind of came back to a pre-crisis state. I'd be happy to go in more detail later in the questions section. If we may move on to the next slide. Thank you. This is another commercial scenario. This is really a great example of being proactive. It's a technology company in the wireless content sharing space. And what we worked on really is to imagine all these things that could happen that would lead to a crisis. So to be ahead of the curve is ideal, and create protocols. In fact, we created a whole crisis communications plan to anticipate all the scenarios how we would then respond, etc. We'll give you some tips a little later. But the key areas for this particular company were, since they're a product company, you know, is there a defect in some way? Does it have bugs? Does it have outages? Things of that nature, right? Very important things when you're dealing with customers. Is the product release delayed? A typical thing if you deal with software and other things like that. Is there data breach? Are there security issues? Are there privacy issues? These are really big in the forefront of many, you know, individuals and companies right now. And then legal issues and compliance. Is the company really, you know, on top of all the things that are required, as they're always changing, right? Management issues. Is there an executive breach of conduct? Are there disgruntled employees? Is there office violence? All of that falls within your crisis communications plan, ideally, so that you can anticipate and respond in the moment. Any items that are related to community positioning, you know, what is your reputation within the community? Did you take an action that causes a lot of problems? I think it's really pertinent right now with the civil unrest. There's some companies who responded quite well and some that did not do so well. And then, of course, things that we're speaking about, like natural disasters. Now, whether that's an earthquake, a flood, or, you know, currently COVID, those all fall into your communications plan, ideally, so that you, like I said, can respond at a moment's notice. And let's go on, one more. Next slide, please. Okay. Oh, sorry. Can we go back one more? I just want to call out one that may have risen to your attention, and I didn't highlight it here. But when we had Hurricane Harvey, there were companies that specialize in cleanup, you know, hazardous waste, those type of things. And a company that I really don't want to name because they've done so well since then, had contractors in a certain area in a residential setting, and the contractors were actually just looking for restrooms, but in the process of that, they kind of started looking around and got caught on camera by the homeowner, and that footage went to local TV stations within 20 minutes or so, actually faster than the owner of this particular company was notified. And because of the delay, they weren't able to have any input on the media coverage. So in crisis communication, one part is also, how is your crisis, if it's, you know, especially if it's impacting the public, or an example of less than stellar behavior, that will be picked up really fast. And examples now are, we all have our iPhones, our Android phones, you know, things are being recorded. And I think as an entity, whether you're a public entity or a private entity, commercial entity, it is, you know, timely to have a process in place to, you know, address those type of situations. And if we can go to the next slide now, thank you. So what we wanted to show you here is the before, during, and after. So maybe some of these tips can be helpful to you. You know, it starts with identifying what could be a disaster in your particular environment. How will you be impacted? Is it something that's originating in your team, your company, your, you know, your school, wherever it may be? Is it a product-related crisis? All of these are really valid, and they obviously have repercussions. Do you have a designated spokesperson? If you're a public affairs office, you know, officer, then obviously that's taken care of. But in a lot of companies, that's not necessarily a given. And the smaller teams certainly don't normally have a need for that, except when it really counts. So have somebody in place. Then do you have a protocol for notification? What's the chain of command? How do you handle any media inquiries? And do you have templates ready, any type of tools that can help your team to really respond in a quickly and transparent fashion? And then have you trained, right? Nothing is, I mean, all of you probably have done safety trainings, the drills for the earthquakes and things like that, but this is not unlike that. You have to make sure your team is really comfortable deploying the strategy when it comes to a crisis. Next. Thank you. So what we really recommend, and I understand not everybody has time or the resources to work on this days on end, but we'll highlight sort of the key items in your communications plan, and we'll offer some tips as to how you can get there. So first of all, you want to make sure you know how to reach your internal and external stakeholders. And I literally mean, is it email, is it calls, is it text? What is the appropriate and most timely way to reach these audiences? And then assign roles, who does what when, including the spokesperson I alluded to earlier. And then really have a strategy for your messaging. It's one thing if it's a minor issue, but if it's really a critical major issue, like an oil spill, right? Obviously, there are different messaging tools and really exact messaging needed. So be factual, be transparent. I would say that's one of our strongest recommendations. Anything that's sort of perceived as a smokescreen really goes back to what Nora said earlier, the trust factor, right? If you mislead your clients or your customers and they find out later, it is going to be a problem. So be upfront, address it, and have it in your messaging. What can you say? Maybe you don't have all the facts, just as Nora said. Provide what you know and have it documented in your strategy as to when you will update things, and then really have an action plan as to how you proceed. Go ahead. Thank you. So the different levels, of course, of your crisis management, if you will. There's operational issues, and emergency responders, the staff, customers. Do you have a hotline? How can people get their question and answers handled? And is your internal team briefed properly so that they can actually then answer all the requests for information that they will receive undoubtedly? On the external side, if you have in fact prepared statements and templates and those type of things, and I would say in summary, let's call them talking points, use those with the designated spokesperson that is obviously reporting back to the chain of command, and then the team will then parse that out to the rest of your internal stakeholders. And the media outreach, I do want to highlight that specifically because a lot of times it seems almost like to get a story placed when you want it is not that easy, but when you don't want it, it's much easier, because if there's a crisis, if it is disaster, obviously there's public concern, there's concern even in business to business environments, right? What is going on with this company? What's going on in terms of remedies, whether it's a refinery that has a problem or it is a product defect, right? Depending on what the product is. If you think about pharma, for instance, that is not a lighthearted topic. In tech, maybe it's not, life-threatening, but it's at minimum, inconvenient or disruptive for the normal course of the business. Monitoring the media coverage that's generated without your input, I would highly recommend that you have somebody on your team do that, or if you, wish outside support, that's certainly available. But monitor what's going on. It's the listening that's really important. It's not only the people you speak to, it's also pertains to what's in the public eye. Is it online, on social media? Is it in print? Is it on TV? What is the reporting on your particular crisis, and how are you intending to manage that? So if you don't know what's going on, you can't respond, right? Ideally, you're proactive, but that's not always possible. And then really use social media to your benefit, right? It's a quick, easy way to update the public and even special groups, business groups, as to the state of affairs. What is the latest information? Where can you go to get additional details? And then make sure, if I may say that so strongly, to have regular, if not daily, meetings with your communications team, whoever's designated on this task force. Make sure they properly debriefed and they are aware of all the changing factors in your particular crisis. And then also, ideally, and this hops back to our ISO days, the trainings and all of that, do a debrief. Look at what worked, what did not work, and take those lessons learned into an update of your crisis communications plan. All right. Next, yeah, thank you. So what you see here is a summary. I alluded to it already. Look at data, super important. Did people actually follow your company more than normal? Did it not raise to their level of attention? Is it reflected in any, online data? And what kind of feedback have you gotten from investors, if you have them? shareholders, and other stakeholders, and look at what you can do even after the fact to remedy the negative impact. So if your brand has taken a hit, what is your plan going forward? How are you going to create goodwill going forward? What can you do to remedy and amend the situation? Okay. Thank you. And just to give you a little bit something to hold on to and remember, we thought we'd give you a framework here, the right framework. So be responsive. Ideally, you're ahead of the curve, but the minute you hear about it, do respond. If you can, refrain from statements like no comment. That just creates more interest in the situation at hand. Be informed and make sure that you share that information. Whatever is, in some case you have to have your legal team obviously at your side. Make sure that you share information as much as possible and be transparent and be generous. So when I say generous, I really mean be visible, don't hide, participate in meetings, possibly public meetings. It could be a town hall meeting. Do a webinar or do a call-in. You can do even these days, Facebook Live to answer certain questions. Just make yourself available to your target audiences, whether that's public or a more B2B type of scenario, and offer support to your clients and customers. How is your particular crisis impacting them, and show what you can do to help them through that time. And then ultimately, the word I've used a few times now, be transparent. Don't try to cover up, and instead, be humble and really show that A, you care, and B, that you are working on solutions. Thank you. This is our Q&A time, I think.
Yeah.
Right, Laura?
This is, I want to thank you so much, Barbara. You've gotten some great concepts that you've been able to share with everybody. We want to open it up for questions. We don't see questions that have been listed previously, but wanted to know, we want to open it up for questions to see. We're in the chat, by the way. Guess not. Okay. Questions. We certainly don't have, we have to be happy to take questions. We wanted to also let you know that this handout, we've actually have a handout for you for Barbara's great with the before, during, and after checklist, communications checklist that we'll be able to send out with the slides. Have people done, had concerns or had communications gaps that they want to figure out some strategies for? We'll be happy to take those questions. This is a little bit about, this is the free communications checklist is waiting. We're going to send this out as well, or you can do it from Barbara. And then if you have some help, you want some help, I'm speaking for Barbara here. She certainly can speak for herself, but if you have questions, you're not really sure on your communications strategies, she certainly can help. And this is a little bit about Connect Consulting. We have been around since 2009. We do crisis communications planning as well as usually it's part of your emergency operations plan, pandemic response recovery planning, reopening planning. We're doing quite a bit of that right now. Alternate care side, evacuation planning, business continuity, training and delivery, development and delivery, do everything from active shooter, workplace violence, de-escalation training, drills and exercises, and also quite a bit of compliance, audit, and improvement planning. If you want, you can send us an email at connect@connectconsulting.biz, or at that hot link there, you can book some time with us if you have any questions. Those are our things. Let's see. Oh, wait, there is a question. Okay. After a crisis, when you mention gathering feedback from stakeholders, is also recommended to gather feedback from employees? And if so, what's the best way to do that? Very good question. Okay. Do you want to take that one, Barbara?
Sure. Yeah, thank you for that question. You know, I think it depends on the size of your organization. You could do this through a number of tools. One, you could do a survey tool, right? You create a battery of questions and you share it with them by email. You could do a meeting, company-wide meeting, could be Zoom meeting, where you offer a platform for input. Texting, I think, has become very popular, but I think given the kind of question, items you would like to address, I would refrain from doing that. So primarily, I would say email. It could be structured like an email addressing people to give free types of input. In other words, not as structured to particular questions. Although I find that when you ask very specific questions, you're going to get more of the data back that you can utilize to then adjust your future activities. And you could have a hotline if you wanted to, internal hotline that is, where employees can leave messages, questions, concerns, if they would like to do so anonymously, right? Because it depends on the trust level also internally. That is everybody comfortable sharing their particular concerns? Certainly, there are, if you're an intranet, then the teams might be able to leave messages there. Those would be sort of the core components, and I'm certainly happy to give more insight offline if you like. So.
Sure. Thank you so much, Barbara. There's another question. In your experience, what is the biggest downfalls in crisis communications occur? In preparation, during, or after? Is there an area that we should be placing extra emphasis on? Another good question, Barbara. I've got some thoughts on.
Yeah, I'm sure you do. I was going to say, between the two of us, we probably have lots of thoughts on this.
Sure.
The thing is, do you anticipate a crisis, yes or no? That will determine everything, right? Because if you're caught by surprise, that's a problem, right? Then you're just struggling to do it as quickly as possible, and you may not do it as systematically as you would like in a normal setting, right? So the pre-planning as much as you can. Certain things are predictable. If you live in an area where hurricanes occur, or out here in California, earthquakes, we don't know when, but it will happen. So let's be prepared for that, right? Cities offer all kinds of guidance in that regard. COVID-19, if we followed international news, maybe we sort of knew that it might come, but I kind of think most of us, myself included, didn't anticipate that we would go into a situation where it's shelter in place. Now, if you can work virtually, that's not such a problem. But if you are a small boutique owner or a restaurant or whatever it is, then that's a much bigger concern. So in that moment, if you are not tuned into what's going on, the current state of affairs, then you may have caught by surprise, and then again, you're struggling. So I would say the before is really, really, really important. But most of all is doing. So if we take the BP example, and actually we could go to Boeing, right? When Boeing had some issues, these are big, big companies with large communications teams and a lot of resources. Did they anticipate an accident or an oil spill? I doubt it. But I would argue that in their manual, somewhere in the communications manual, there was some type of plan how to deal with a crisis. The issue at the time is, do you acknowledge the crisis? Are you, upfront about it and you own it, if I can say it casually, or are you trying to buy time? And that's the crucial factor. If you're buying time, you don't really want to release information. It can be very detrimental to the ultimate outcome of your entire resolution. So I would say the during is maybe the most important, because if you don't inform the stakeholders, if people are caught by surprise, it's never pretty. Nori, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I do want to add to that. I think that I completely agree with Barbara about the pre-planning piece. That's just so crucial. And part of the pre-planning is not just pre-planning messaging, but also pre-planning who. Do you have a media list? That needs to be ready at the hand. That's part of your communications pre-planning. Do you have a media list? Do you have a public officials list? Do you have those kinds of things in your communications plan? Do you have your staff trained in communications? So again, one of the things that Barbara said was, do you have someone identified that can be your spokesperson? Well, if maybe the person that you have that you identified, that's your spokesperson, that person's on vacation or their wife's in labor or something. So that's, you want to have more than one person in advance trained who can be a spokesperson that's going to speak as succinctly, and you don't want to have someone with an offhand comment like the, Mr. CEO, BP CEO going, when am I going to get my life back? You want someone that is trained ahead of time in communications. And it's not saying that you don't say anything to the media, but again, going back to the being sagent, being as efficient and empathetic and sympathetic. And then as new information comes alive, then you change. Do we have any other questions?
I was going to add one thing, Nora, if you mind. Because you said media, right? That's a crucial point. They will call you. We had a case where a company employee had, contacted a reporter about some closures within a company, but the company itself had not announced it, right? So the media was ahead of the company management. And we found actually that we could not find the CEO, who happened to be on vacation and didn't answer the cell phone. So I just want to highlight how important it is what you just said. Have more than one person on your list as a point person, and make sure that you're responsive. If you do not respond to an inquiry, the media will take it and run with it. The story is not yours anymore necessarily. So I would encourage everybody to take, really good notice of that.
Yeah, definitely. So do we have any, I think those are all our questions. Let's see. Yeah, those are all their questions at this time. So we really want to thank you so much for joining us. Not often that you get actually 15 minutes of your life back, so we are certainly doing that, 13 minutes. Oh wait, actually, we have one more question that just came through. Can you walk us through a case where you were involved in and the company did not want to acknowledge the problem, and what did you do? That's a good sticky question. Thank you. So you guys have come up with good ones. So I've got some thoughts on that. I can chime in, but Barbara, do you want to take that?
Sure. I think we both can take that, right? Because we can think of some scenarios. Sure.
Yeah.
The most obvious one is actually the situation around Harvey that I mentioned earlier, because it was a large, a global company, if you will, and headquarters did not want to address media inquiries at all. They basically wanted to go quiet on it, whereas the particular branch, if you will, felt that the entire operation was at risk, right? Because of the perception of the company not being trustworthy and not protecting the property and simply the confidentiality of the homeowners in question. When in fact it turned out that because these gentlemen got arrested at the time, and that got onto the news as well, they had actually not stolen anything. Yes, they didn't behave according to the code of conduct, and they got fired, but the damage was done. So there was a friction between headquarters and the particular regional operation, and they then decided to go it alone, if you will, primarily by going directly to the stakeholders. So in other words, taking care of customers first, employees in tandem, and then sort of work their way through a plan of thought leadership around the subject of, the whole cleanup after a disaster, to tackle the topic that way and rebuild the trust in their particular regions that they operated in. Headquarters was not particularly pleased, but ultimately when they saw the positive outcome of their actions, they kind of came around. So that's a really tricky one. Suppressing the information, pretending it doesn't exist, it tends to backfire. I mean, I just have to say it that way. And we do obviously our best to convince the teams in charge to cooperate and participate. Ultimately, it's at their discretion. And on occasion, we've actually parted ways with a client if we feel that it's disingenuous, right? If things are really not factual, we certainly don't want to promote anything less than truthful.
Right. My example is that it was during one of the wildfires last year, and someone put out some information about the wildfire that said that that there would be a shelter, and it somehow they didn't do rumor control. Someone, just random person, said everyone was going to be sheltering at the high school in this local community that was hit by wildfire. And the local emergency managers were not monitoring the social media. They weren't monitoring hashtags. They weren't monitoring, anything related to the fire, and they were just trying to, just kind of get information out there. Well, this information was wrong. Like, there was going to be no sheltering at the high school. It's going to be at another site. And they wanted to deal with it, and they said, well, let's just put out the information when we know, but they delayed in information. So people showed up at the high school going, okay, I'm evacuated, I'm here, but it wasn't the case. So what they ended up having to do in that community is they've had to send basically an email, not just an email, but they had to send a, social media post and say, okay, we heard this information. We saw this was happening, but we thought it was resolved. It wasn't. And okay, here's the new information. So it was a little bit of their egg on their face, but they were able to correct the situation because they put out the credible information. But had they let that situation go on, they would have had 50 people show up at a high school that wasn't open for a shelter, that could also be another public relations nightmare too. So again, shift, pivot as much as you can. Again, that honesty and transparency is really important in communications. I think we have any other questions? Check in one more time.
No.
Okay. I think we got them all, right? Okay, well, if you have any further questions, you have our email for Barbara and I, and we'll also send this out in the slides again via email. Thank you so much for joining us today. Hopefully this has been helpful as you try to develop your own your own crisis communication strategies. And we'll give you back a few more minutes of your day. Thanks a lot. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.